Okay, seeing lots and lots of you arriving now. I'll just give it a minute or so before I do a formal hello. Let some of the others come through the virtual door. Okay, I think I'll make a start. So welcome everybody who's arrived so far, and I'm sure there's more people arriving as we go through the hour here. Welcome to the IED Institute of Economic Development panel on how we can reconcile our growth with net zero ambitions, and I'm really pleased to be here today. This follows on, I think, from a panel that we done, it was the back end of last year now, around net zero, which was really interesting and stimulated some really interesting thoughts and comments from some of the members and the people who joined, that we wanted to kind of pull out a little bit more. So we've got a really good panel for you today. So I'm pleased to see so many people have signed up, and signed up to have a listen. And this won't be sort of the end of it either, because as sort of I was looking through the paragraph that we'd written to kind of stimulate the conversation, I realized that there's an incredible amount to unpack in some of this stuff. And there's certainly going to be themes that we're going to be looking at over the next hour that we'll need to explore further. So we're primarily talking about the issue of growth and whether the metrics around GDP and GVA are applicable or useful in their sole context anymore in terms of our economic health, and how that might relate to kind of our real challenges around net zero, but also, you know, there's other challenges around social inclusion and cost of living and all these other things that are happening at the moment. We find ourselves in a kind of system of challenges. So hopefully we'll explore some of those issues. I'm going to go around the panel and introduce everybody. Firstly, I'm going to introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name's Paul Frainer. I'm one of the directors at the Institute of Economic Development. I'm also a partner for local government at TPX Impact. Yeah, real interest in a lot of this stuff, really. I mean, we work quite closely with local government, and I've been in local government myself, sort of the sharp end of how, you know, how some of this stuff plays out in the real world, I suppose. And yeah, really interested to hear your thoughts. And we've got a super panel, so I'm going to go around my screen as I see it. So firstly, we've got Zoe Billingham. So Zoe, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, I'm Zoe Billingham, and I'm Director of IPPR North, looking at all things regional economics, regional policy and good growth.
Thanks, Zoe. And I think I'll come back again to you, because I think we've got a little bit of a kind of 5 minutes slot for you to talk about some of the things that you're also interested in discussing through this session, and we'll see how much we can get through of each of those, if that ties in. Just one quickly before we come to Owen, just wanted to know, if you've got questions all the way through, if you put them into the quick Q&A now, what we'll try and do is we'll try and include them in the conversation, answer them as we're going along, and we'll have a printout, saying that loosely, so that's showing my age there, at the end, with questions that we haven't got to, so that maybe we can pick up some of those issues. But Owen, over to you.
Well, I'm Owen Garling. I'm the Knowledge Transfer Facilitator at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. And we have a particular interest in things like, how do you measure progress, and how do we understand how we can change what we do, and how do you feed ideas into policymakers?
Thanks, Owen. That's just the best job title ever, by the way. I love that. I love your job title. Joe, to you.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. I'm Joe Sarling. I'm the Director of Policy and Research here at New Local. Our bag at New Local is all about community power and communities, to try and give them as much influence and as say, and shaping the services that they need. There's a whole range of things to unpack here, and I'm looking forward to this discussion, because a lot of this boils down to what people need, what communities need, and how do we take that forwards.
Great, thanks, Joe. Well, actually, I'm going to start with you then, as we go back around in reverse now. So, you know, give us a feel. I mean, you know, I talked about it this morning when I was having a look at it and refreshing myself on, you know, those links. You know, this piece that we're talking around in terms of this reconciliation of what we talk about in growth. What does it mean to you?
Yeah, no, thanks, Paul. Great to be able to chat to everybody. Look, as I said, New Local's focus is all about communities, and so that's going to be the flavour of my, few minutes to begin with, and I'm sure that we can unpack some of these things going forwards. Look, I want to paint a little bit of a picture to begin with, right? And that picture is the last 15 years. And what have we seen in that last 15 years? Well, we've had a financial crash followed by austerity. We've had stagnant wages. We've had COVID or having COVID, depending on how you look at it, had poor productivity over those 10 or 15 years. We now face a European war. There's an oil and gas crisis, and climate change has risen up the agenda. All of these things are huge, huge topics and have a massive impact on individuals and communities going forward. What's been the collection or the collective issue here of these topics? It's actually been impact. That impact has made people feel out of control. There's been greater concern. There's health concerns, there's health worries. I think for a lot of people, there's been a reprioritization of what's important and what's not important. That's both from an individual perspective, then a household perspective, and then a community's perspective. I think people are looking at, well, actually, what's my standard of living? What's well-being like now? I think there's been a great pivot from the standard kind of measures of things and standard measures of either success at an individual level or standard measures of growth, productivity, and so on at a more national level. I think there's just a reframing here, which is what's important, what does success look like, what do I want from it? And well-being is an important thing there. But something I did want to highlight is this need for resilience. I think we've been incredibly lucky pre-financial crash of the huge, well, decades worth. Of course, there have been blips along the way, but that level of growth that we saw pre-financial crash may not ever return. And I think the last 15 years has seen this issue, which people just feel like, I need greater resilience, I need greater control here. I feel a little bit more out of control about what's going on all of these topics. And how does that manifest itself at a local level too? So what's the response here? Well, from a New Local perspective, and when we work with partners and communities on the ground, what do we see? We see first and foremost this notion of community coming ever more increasingly to the fore. People feel secure there. They understand the relationships that are needed, both in an informal and formal way, whether that's in a public service perspective or your neighbours, whatever it might be. This sense of community has come much further to the fore. There's been this huge demand shift about what people need and what people want, groups being formed and so on. And I think actually at an individual level, and I'll come to this in just a minute, but individual level, there's been this greater sense of what does my community need? And I think what's really interesting in one of the shifts, which is a tangential point to the overall session title, Paul, is actually that notion of the individual can't be taken out of the context of the community. And so now people are thinking, well, what does the community need? What does success look like? We want more influence. So it's just a couple of things I wanted to highlight before handing over. The first is some recent polling that we did on this, on community power and the sense of what people need and want. And there's lots to unpack here, but a few things just to pull out. The first is over 50% of people polled across the country, this isn't its representative sample, were unconfident that national politicians could solve big issues like cost of living crisis and climate change. Cost of living rose to about 2/3, I think, from memory. This is huge. And there's this big disconnect. There's a distrust and a disconnect between national politicians and the community. The second is that it's 8 out of 10 people think that their national politician just don't understand them. They just have no concept of what their community is like and what those issues are. And around 3/4 of people want them to transfer more power to those communities. So we can unpack a lot of this stuff when we talk about, the drive towards net zero, and there's huge opportunities there for communities to come to the fore. But my takeaway message here is that people see themselves in communities. Those communities want more power and more influence. And if we want to move to a net zero world, actually, this is a huge opportunity to not be afraid to keep small, and then by the aggregate of small endeavours, can we solve issues at the macro level?
Joe, thanks. It's a really helpful opener as well, and I mean, ties really into some thoughts that I've kind of thought around the local government element and that kind of bottom-up piece, which is so important. I'll come around to the others, but people feel free to stick questions into the Q&A already. I'm going to take some notes as we go around so we can kind of pick up some of those individual issues. Owen, I'm going to come to you and some of the work that you're doing in terms of the Bennett Institute.
Thanks, Paul. And my points two of them probably don't quite link with Joe's, and the third one does. There are 3 points that I'd like to make, if possible. So the first one is kind of picking up the issue around measurement beyond GDP. So I'm lucky enough to work here at the Bennett Institute with Diane Coyle, who's done a lot of work at looking beyond GDP and has actually written a book called Beyond GDP, which is actually a really interesting read and kind of tells the history of GDP over the last 70 odd years. But one of the things that we're really aware of, and I think people are becoming more aware of, is that GDP just measures the size of the pie. So it tells you how big your pie can be, but it doesn't tell you anything about your store cupboard or the equipment you need to cook the pie, or even the staff you have within the bakery to make it. So we're very much looking at, we have a program of work called the Wealth Economy, which is looking at actually how do you understand those assets that you need to have in order to carry on making stuff? And how do you do that in a way that means you can understand what you can do in the future as well? So the beauty of it is thinking about kind of capitals and assets means that the future price is already baked into the costs you have. So you can start thinking about the future resilience as well, so picking up Joe's point on resilience. So we think that's a really useful way to kind of move beyond GDP. And our model has 6 different capitals. So we think about natural capital, social capital, knowledge capital, physical capital, institutional capital, and human capital. And rather than thinking of them purely in isolation and as kind of silos, it's very tempting to look at those and think, okay, I can do a stock take of those capitals in my area. It's actually about the relationships between them. That's the really important bit, is how they flow together and how they work together. So how does natural capital, for example, support human capital and people's health? So it's interesting, the other day when it was really hot, I took one of our dogs for a walk, went to the park and realized they planted it in such a way that there were trees all the way around and there was shade all the way around to stay in. So that's kind of a really nice example of somewhere which is kind of hadn't been thought of in those ways, but you can kind of see the natural capital, the benefits of natural capital there. And I think the other kind of thing to think about with this approach, and I think it's really important for this conversation as well, is that it shifts the focus of decision makers. So rather than seeing themselves potentially just as budget holders and looking after a budget for a short period of time, if you're thinking about the assets that you have available to you, you're moving to a much more positive way of looking at the world, a much more kind of a sense of stewardship. So it's about how do you keep those assets? How do you make the best use of those things that you have in the time that you're looking after them and pass them on to somebody else? So I think that's kind of a really interesting mindset change that can be thought about. The second point I wanted to make relates to a piece of work, again, by colleagues of mine, looking at economic complexity, which is a really interesting way of looking at local economic structures. So what it does, rather than saying all economies are exactly the same, it says local places' economies are structured differently and have strengths in different areas. And so it's kind of there's some interesting economics behind it, which I kind of get a bit lost on, but there's some nice graphs as well. So the work that colleagues here at the Bennett did looked at 4 places. So they looked at Manchester and Oldham, and they looked at Cambridge and Peterborough. And what was really interesting when they mapped how the economies looked in those 4 different places is actually Cambridge and Manchester look much more similar than Manchester and Oldham, or Cambridge and Cambridge and Peterborough. So it's not always the closest places that have the best fit. So I think this is a really interesting hook to think about the move to net zero, and to think about actually what are those sectors that places specialize in, and how can you understand what are those green jobs or those green roles and the green economy jobs that are most achievable for different places. So it's not saying everywhere needs to jump into battery production, but it's saying actually we've got a real strength in this kind of a thing. How can we shift it to the most likely next sector as well, and make sure that you're taking the economy with you on those things. And also I think it stresses the importance then as well of not having a one-size-fits-all approach, but also of how can different places in different bits of the country think together as well. So if there are places like Oldham and Peterborough that are more similar, how do you get those people in a room together to talk about what they're doing, how they're doing things, what the changes are that they could see making as well? So just kind of how do you share this stuff, I think, is a really important thing. Then the third point I was going to make kind of picks up a bit around this idea of impact on communities and people. So it kind of goes back to Joe's points. And I think one of the things that's interesting at the moment is we're still working through the consequences of the last economic transformation. So we're kind of in this post-industrial world. There are still lots of problems that are still arising because of how that transition was handled. So I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago looking at County Durham, where they had a policy back in the 1950s to basically grade all of the communities according to their economic potential. And this led to 1/3 of communities being rated as category D, which meant they had no future. And they were just dealt purely with as kind of economic units, and they received no funding from the county council for 25 years, these places. Some of them folded, some of them didn't, some of them showed incredible community power to keep going. But it feels like a really good example of how not to do these things. When it sprang to mind the other day, looking at, there was a report published by the Tyndall Centre at UEA, which looked at kind of the impact of sea level rises, and said that it looks as if between about 200,000 homes and businesses are at risk of abandonment in the UK by 2050. And so I think there's something really important now about having those conversations and decisions that need to be made about those places in the future, and thinking, how do we do that now with communities and understand how we take people with us? So those are my 3 starter points.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Owen. And it does strike me that obviously with you and Joe having set your points out, that it's even more to unpack than I'd even initially planned, because there's lots of things there that I hadn't even really came across my thought path. But I'm going to come to, there's some questions coming through as well, but I'm going to come around to you, Zoe, now and give you a bit of your context from an IPPR perspective.
Yeah, brilliant. And thanks so much for this discussion. I think for those of us working in this space for some years now, it perhaps feels like we've had this discussion over and over again, but actually there's good ideas and there's good timing, right? And I do, as I will set out in a minute, think that this is good timing, and so very happy to be here today. I suppose just picking up on what's been said already by Joe and Owen, I mean, there's a clear critique of GDP as it stands that I think we're probably all familiar with, whether that's to do with the fact it doesn't take into account environmental degradation, doesn't look at unpaid work, and it certainly doesn't take into consideration the distribution of growth between people or places. And I suppose it's the places in particular that I'm particularly interested in with my regional economist hat on. But also to say, and I think this is something that we've picked up at IPPR North a lot through our work and State of the North report, is the decoupling of growth and earnings that we've seen since the financial crisis, which, speaks to the heart of why, most people don't think GDP is theirs. And I think we're all haunted by, was it a few years ago already that someone shouted on a political campaign, whose GDP is that? And that really speaks to the heart of this, right? Who's actually benefiting from growth? And since, of course, we have made progress in terms of where economic thinking is on this stage. Back in 2009, of course, we had the Stiglitz, Sen and Fatuzzi commission, which already kind of started to set out a dashboard of indicators that we should be using as opposed to just GDP growth. Of course, Diane Coyle at Cambridge, as Owen's referred to, has led some absolutely incredible work on the different types of capital, and natural capital being one of those, and how should we better account for the natural capital we own as a country, and how that's then traded off with growth or taken into consideration with economic growth. And the government itself, let's not forget, only a year ago, the Dasgupta review, which reported exactly on this question, setting out that economy should be within nature, not outside of it. We have an economy thanks to nature. So this is really net zero and GDP, cannot exist without each other. But at the same time, when you look at how government is continuing to look at economic growth, I was kind of just cruising around some of the stats online, as you do when you're as nerdy as us, and they still define GDP as meaning GDP growth is when the economy and resources available are growing, which is a kind of interesting open door for this agenda, because of course those of us who are tuned into the environmental debates know that our resources won't infinitely grow, and so actually those two things are do work against each other. So maybe that's on the back of the Dasgupta review, something that we should be pushing collectively and with all our different institutions and hats on, because there's clearly an open door there. Well, hopefully. I'm a former Treasuryite, so I can egg on my former colleagues. so I think progress is happening, and I also would like to pick up the local link that's been talked about so far in this discussion, because in my work and our work at IPPR North with local leaders and mayors, they're already looking at a dashboard of indicators. You know, the local government, metro mayors, you know, GDP isn't, they know it isn't the be all and end all, because they know people in their places don't necessarily benefit from UK level GDP, you know, growth or statistics. And we know very well the regional inequalities of this country and how GDP growth is concentrated in some areas, you know, not benefiting others. So local leaders are already championing the sort of dashboard approach. I think anything we can do to help move on the accounting, the natural accounting that Owen spoke about, and how we can get that, put that into practice from a kind of idea into actually changing government accounting models is super welcome, of course. So you know, I'm pretty pragmatic, I think, pragmatic and idealistic, I'd like to think. So on the one hand, you know, having worked in Treasury and understanding how this kind of institutional lock-in happens, that, you know, Treasury thinks one way and then the international institutions think another way, and then central government makes local government bid for money on the basis of growth. You know, there are ways that GDP is still locked in, very much locked into our system, but I do think there is an increasing amount of pressure and thinking about how we can actually change that. And I think actually when you look at local leaders and metro mayors, they're sort of doing it already. So I'm feeling optimistic, and that's why I think this is a great time for this discussion.
Well, Zoe, that's really good. I mean, I told you we had a super panel for you, and I'm really excited about this conversation, although we're already 20 minutes into it. So thank you for that. We've got a couple of questions coming through. No doubt we will be back to you, Zoe, to talk about Treasury, because I'm sure that that's something that we'll be definitely interested in exploring in terms of how we do this. And there's a couple of questions that come through, so I don't want to just ignore them straight away. Let's go to those straight away, and then we can move through some of your points. We've got a question for Joe. Where do you see businesses as part of the communities that you've talked about? And I could answer to that too, I'm sure we all could, but what's your feel for that from New Local's perspective and your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, at its heart, businesses are really very important to the community. They are part of the community. They are the community, and so on and so forth. I think the difference here that I'd like to draw as a comparison is: do those businesses serve those local areas in the way that those local areas want and need? And what are the trade-offs for those people that are using those businesses? Of course, you know, I don't want to make this quite as binary and or as obvious as a, you know, global multinational versus a local kind of business, because I think the actual argument is much more nuanced and difficult than that, which is, you know, sometimes those big businesses are the ones that people want to go to, and so on. So we shouldn't be we shouldn't be prescribing too much what business looks like, but fundamentally business is an important part of that community and community setup. What I would say is, I think whenever we're looking at a local level, and this is probably, you know, in talking to councils and so on, when we're thinking about, you know, what does good growth look like, or inclusive growth, or whatever we want to call it, and it goes back in the annals of time of this being called different things over decades, right? But whatever we want to call it, I think fundamentally this is about, well, how can we unlock some of that potential for those local businesses? What do they need? You know, what's their link with local education, for example, and what do people want in terms of skills to be able to work in those businesses? Is it working well together? What can those businesses offer that local community for that extra resilience? What are people willing to trade off in order to have those businesses there? I think there's something really interesting here, which makes the conversation much more holistic than previous conversations. But you know, fundamentally, it will take all sorts of all sectors within the community to work together on certain things. And actually, I think mobilizing, coming to Zoe's point around, you know, ideas versus just good timing, there's a good timing point here, which is actually could businesses, could communities, that's residents, could councils work together on these big topics and solve challenges for themselves? And we see this on a in a particularly like environmental, well, not just an environmental perspective. One case study that kind of springs to mind here is Ambition Lawrence Weston in Bristol, which is huge. And, you know, that's a very deprived estate, essentially marginalized community, and not really given much chance. And they took power themselves. They wanted to make a change. They did a huge amount of work around engagement with the community and making sure that they were ongoing conversations about what they needed in that local area, and so on and so forth. And it's grown to a particular level now where they now own a supermarket there, which is a great community endeavor. And then, you know, secondary and tertiary wise now, They're looking at these big offshore wind farms to secure energy for that local area. Like, that's community power at its heart, and I love the sound of that.
Thanks, Joe. I'm going to invite Zoe and Owen to come in as well if they've got a point to make around this. The one thing that strikes me around local businesses and local business offers that I feel like we're in a position where we are having a shifting demand. And I wonder around this question around this kind of movement and shift towards services rather than a product economy in the way that we do things, and how that is going to affect things. And we take a really, I find we always take quite a short-term view. It's very difficult not to. I've worked but broadly in politics for the last 10 years, so it's very difficult to try and think certainly long-term. But I mean, that's going to have a fundamental effect on the nature and the offers that people are going to be able to put together for their businesses, for businesses that are currently operating, but also new businesses that are looking to grow in those areas too, right? Because the move away from traditional product, basically we still need products, there's no doubt about that. It's not something that we're going to disappear, but a service economy is a slightly different beast when it goes into full flow, right? Is any thoughts from you two on the businesses in local areas?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, Paul, and one that's really topical in Cambridge. So Cambridge it's a knowledge-based economy, so it's neither kind of service or product-based. But what's become particularly clear is that it's about the lived environment and the place as much as the businesses. So how do you make sure that there's a balance between the things that people want to do and the businesses that come here? So it's actually what attracts businesses to places is a really important thing to think about. Is it green spaces? Is it about having cultural amenities? Are those kind of questions, I think, really come to the fore as well and need to be thought through. And then kind of the flip side of that is then business really thinking closely about what its role is in helping provide those things too, and what that connection back can be as well. So I think those kind of things I think are really relevant at the moment here in particular.
Yeah, absolutely, Owen. I know Cambridge well enough to understand its economy as well in my last few years there. I think in some ways I'm going to move on. There's another question in there which I could spend all day answering, which I'm not going to answer just yet. We'll bring that back in a minute around devolution, because it's something that's really, really interesting in terms of what all of you've been saying, but also specifically use Owen in relation to, what you were talking about around local leaders and potentially more power to local leaders to be able to look at what they can do in their areas, have more power in their areas to influence them at a regional space, because not all regions are the same, and there's huge nuance even in small geographic areas, as Owen's mentioned, around the Cambridge, Peterborough and Manchester Oldham piece. I'm just going to ask you a question now, that from your perspectives, that because I think a lot of this gets muddied, and we might be talking to a group of 60 people who now understand growth and economies across the board, but one of the things that often gets muddy is when we talk about growth, we talk about a number of things interchangeably, and I think the general public and lots of people get really confused about what we mean by when we talk about growth. So I'm going to ask you what you're talking about when you're talking about growth, and then I'm just going to unpack a little bit of some of the things that people say to me. This is what you mean by growth. So Joe, define me growth.
Wow, we're doing this. We're doing definitions of what growth is. Wow. Okay, that's brilliant. No, look, without wanting to gazump you a little bit here, I do want to take a little bit of a step back, which is I'm more interested in what people want and need from their areas, and I recognise that in some regards, sometimes that requires economic growth to achieve them, and others will require greater resilience in order to protect things. And so when I talk about growth, I'm really talking about that as almost like an input in order to achieve our goals, rather than the goal in and of itself. So I firstly want to understand, what do people want and need, whether that's a well-being perspective. Do people just need more time? What does that mean? And in order to achieve those things at an individual and community level, what do we need to do? Is that a reallocation of resources? Is it we need growth in order to fund those things? That's the kind of question for me. So to answer your question, what do I mean by growth? Of course, there's an element of that is going to be an increase in productivity. I mean, we've all done economics 101. There's a productivity point here, so long as there's a resilience angle there too. It's that growth of that output by area and so on. And it's probably the increase of value and the additional value that's created by an endeavour. And for me, even on that topic, I keep coming back to well, actually, any kind of increase in increase in value is going to come from multiple sectors, right? Public sector can increase value in an area, private sector can increase value. So really, for me, what is growth is a second order question from what are we trying to achieve, and does growth help us do that?
I was on mute. That's a very good answer. It was almost a diplomatic political answer there, Joe, but it was absolutely great. And thank you very much for that. Zoe, I'm going to come to you. And yeah, don't spend too long on it, but it is just a question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with much of what Joe has been said, to be honest, on what growth is. And again, I would point to outcomes being the most interesting product of that growth as well. So I don't think I've got much to add on that specific question, but picking up on the local leadership question, which maybe is the one in the chat, and the extent to which devolution, if I may.
Of course,
okay?
Please go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. It's informal.
I think it's an interesting one, because I think it kind of presupposes that local leaders are more interested in the distribution of growth than national leaders, which I don't think is a given, and I think that's a political question in of itself, right? So I don't think devolution per se guarantees that, but I do think, leaders that are in and amongst their communities every day, as opposed to on Fridays and Saturdays, have a better chance of understanding or seeing in real terms the experience that people are having of the economy, and seeing that GDP growth isn't necessarily theirs or adding to their place. So I would hope by design, devolution does increase that exposure, and hence increase that sensitivity to the distribution of the proceeds of growth. But I don't think it's guaranteed, would be my response.
Yeah, thanks, Zoe. And I'm going to just come in quickly. I'm going to come back to Joe, because he's asked to come back. He's got another point to bring on to that. But just quickly, my take, and I will come to you, Owen. I mean, because this does directly move us back into the zone of what we're talking around the net zero issue as well. Is I've just come out of working in Cambridge, as Owen knows. It's a very high growth area, and there's a lot of sensitivities around that, and much of that comes from what people perceive as overdevelopment and housing growth. But at the same time, we're also in a housing crisis, and we have problems in terms of bringing people into homes, and a lot of the time that gets mistaken for the fact that we need to just do more development and then to house more people, and that's just destroying the environment. It's causing problems for net zero. So it's a really difficult, messy unpicking. It's not that people don't need homes. Maybe they need the right homes. Maybe we need the right homes and jobs to improve productivity, to improve quality of life, to improve people's net contribution back into the economy, which actually is a good thing to productivity, rather than growing exponentially. But Joe, I'm going to come back to you quickly, because I know you wanted to bring a point in on this.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just be very brief, because I'm conscious that Owen will want to come in on this too. It was something that Zoe said there about the local leadership, I suppose, for want of a better phrase. And I think for me, what that touched upon was, when I think of growth, I think about the fundamentals to growth, which don't change. It's just about how we use them, where we invest them in order to achieve different outcomes, which Zoe eloquently talked about. So for me, it's, what are the fundamentals? Well, transport infrastructure, skills, social infrastructure, these are the fundamentals. Those things don't change. When I think about growth, I think, well, actually, we're going to need to do probably something in those spaces, but we probably might need to change how we look at them, or how we invest, away from current models. And I won't make Zoe talk about the Treasury yet. We'll leave that to right at the end. But how we invest, how that happens, rather than, do we need to throw out the fundamentals of what economic growth looks like and what's the bedrock? No, we just probably need to rethink about how we do it.
Thanks. Straight on to you, Owen, and then we'll wrap up this little part of the discussion.
Thanks. I mean, I'm kind of in broad agreement with Joe and Zoe as well on this one. I suppose the thing for me is that it's about how you turn inputs into outputs, but equally, what are you looking at when you're thinking about those inputs, and making sure you're considering all the different things that are happening, and understanding the trade-offs. So if you're making a decision to build more houses, what's the impact on other things in the area? So how does that affect things? It's, again, that capitals approach. How does it affect the natural capital of a place? Are there ways that you could actually improve it, and really think as broadly as possible about those different, both the intended and the unintended consequences of growth, which I think is done by looking as broadly as possible the things that contribute towards it.
Thanks very much, Owen. And I think that it's really interesting, isn't it, to start talking about this stuff and actually just asking really naive questions, because we all make lots of assumptions about what we think we know, whereas actually, you know, lots of people mean different things by that, because there's a lot of confusion. There's a really interesting question that stopped halfway through in the chat. I can't see the rest of it. I want to see the rest of that question, so please finish it off. Right, I'm going to slightly shift away a little bit, because one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the opening was something that you said, Owen, around these 200,000 homes and businesses that are at risk from climate change. Now, I think, like, if you really unpack that, we all know that, whatever the net zero target might be, 1.5, 1.7, 1.9, 2.1, whatever we get to, because we're not doing enough, we are in climate change. And that mitigation is not only just on a personal human basis, but massively on an economic basis. It's something we totally ignore. And the loss of 200,000 homes and jobs, I don't, I can't put metrics to do that. I mean, that seems fundamentally catastrophic, right? That we should be thinking about this. How do we ensure that this is something, it's not a case of reconciliation anymore. It's a case of, this is a catastrophic piece for the economy. So, I mean, I'd like to bring in, Joe and Zoe, if your thoughts on that particular point, because I think it's a really interesting one to explore. Anyone want to jump in first while I'll have a look through the questions again? Or Owen, if you wanted to expand a little bit more on it.
I don't mind jumping in at all. That's fine. Thanks, Paul. I mean, yeah, that is catastrophic. I won't say that's one of the reasons we moved during COVID from London to Buxton, being the highest town in the country, but playing the long game there. But yeah, fundamentally, that is catastrophic. I think what's really interesting about things like that, and really importantly, is I think lots of people, certainly the panelists and people on this call today, will be screaming at the screen, essentially saying, yeah, we told you so, this would happen, people involved in this kind of topic, and it's always set up as this notion of being right or wrong, and so on. What I think is really interesting is actually how much the market is starting to move in this space too. They are often latecomers to this party, but indeed they will be invitees. And I think what's really interesting is for all the potential disappointment around greenwashing and so on, I think there's an interesting move to ESG and that kind of investment. I think there's something really interesting about how people start to invest cash and money and so on going forwards. I certainly think in the built environment, this has been a topic that's been going on for a very long time. I mean, the biggest issue is always retrofitting existing buildings and not new buildings. And so, of course, putting in better energy efficiency into new buildings is significantly cheaper and easier. It's the retrofitting that is difficult, but unfortunately the retrofitting is super unsexy and requires lots of grant to do. So it's always really tricky. So there's something in that. My conclusion point would be, actually, I think communities have had this at its heart for quite a long time. They understand the difficulties. They might not necessarily make the direct link between improving their local area and being more green because it's the right thing to do and it's a nice thing to do for their area, and climate change. But we should absolutely tell them that it's a fundamental and important part of overcoming that bigger macro piece, which is climate change. And I think of work that's done by, like, groundwork, for example, in Manchester, and greening streets and so on, to improve that local area, but also that's fundamental against fighting climate change. Or if we go to Europe, for example, and you look at Lisbon and their participatory budget setting, of which I think it was the last few years that there was either a green section or it went fully green. So communities can then pick and choose or make the case for certain projects, so long as it hits the criteria of improving the local area through green kind of endeavors. So there's something in this about harnessing the power of communities and maybe just giving them license to say, you want to do these good things, that will also help us in net zero and climate change.
Yeah, Lisbon example is a great one, Joe. Just on that, before I invite Zoe and Owen to comment on this, I mean, but doesn't, in some ways, and this is not a question to be answered right now, the challenges that we have stimulate the opportunities for businesses to help deliver those challenges. You're talking about retrofit. It's a classic example. There isn't enough skills to do retrofit. The government done the grant scheme a year and a half ago, whatever. There wasn't enough people who could feasibly fit retrofit schemes. So, are we do we need to do better at signposting future demand so we can empower those businesses or those communities who are thinking about looking at those opportunities to be able to, to move in the direction of travel of the market, right? Because we are, whether like it or lump it, right now we still live in a free market system. So, let's use it to the advantage that we have. So I think that there is definitely a question around, the right sorts of businesses, the right sorts of demand that we are stimulating to generate not just clean growth and clean tech and all these other things, but actually stimulate the things that we actually need to get to to get to those points to move forward in that conversation. But that's just it's a hypothetical question in some ways, so you have to think about it. But Zoe, Owen, did you want to come in on the 200,000 houses and jobs lost? Zoe.
I'd just like to say, just picking up on your point just there, Paul, is that this is where the kind of classic long-term commitment from government needed urgently comes in, which is, government 101 problem. But as you've mentioned, the Greens Home Grant, that was kind of the most eye-catching, at least, government scheme that there was out there to insulate retrofit homes, and with a big government subsidy, it was then pulled, of course, and as Joe rightly said, partly because there wasn't the people there to actually deliver it, but also you had kind of clusters of small businesses, people transitioning to become retrofitters from other trades, and then suddenly you're told that their business model is totally undermined because you're taking the funding from under their feet. So when we know there's such large problems coming down the track, as you were saying, Paul, whether that's to do with jobs, homes, whole villages that will soon not be climate viable, it's just a bit of a, and all of us working in it. And as someone said earlier, you kind of get to the stage where you're like, lots of people have been saying this for a long time, it's an emergency, and reconciling those two things. But that's at the heart of the climate debate, and ensuring government think more urgently about this. And this is why I think collectively we all do need to push on the government, even to respond to its own review on ensuring that climate is taken into consideration when it thinks about the economy, because as their own reviewer said, the economy exists within nature.
Thanks, Zoe, and helpfully back to you, Owen, to maybe wrap up this point, because it was your initial point that that stimulated the discussion.
Yeah, I suppose one thing I'd add is that although the need to do this is speeding up, this is something that's been going on for centuries. So, living in East Anglia as I do, and going to kind of the coast, the East Coast is constantly under threat from this. So it's really interesting if you kind of look at the longer term historical perspective and think about a place like Dunwich, which was one of the major ports in the 12th, 13th century, and since then has been wiped out and is now underneath the sea. So this is something we're constantly fighting with. So I think it's about understanding actually what's been done before as well. But I think it's about acknowledging the pace needs to change, and also having those really difficult conversations that might be around this place is just not, we don't see this place as being potentially viable for whatever reason, but coming to a really clear reasoning for why that is, rather than doing the kind of the County Durham way that I mentioned earlier, where they just sat down with a map and kind of went through it and said, well, these places are all your category D, you've got no future. So it goes back to Joe's point as well, I think, about how do you engage communities in these discussions too.
Yeah, it's super interesting, and it is such a difficult, challenging time. I'm not going to delve into politics today because I just think it's too big a subject, but it is another major challenge of where we're at in the 21st century. We seem to have moved really, really quickly into very populist short-term thinking around politics, which really doesn't help those problems. If it doesn't help those decisions, and in some ways there's always a question around what's actually the real picture and what's not the real picture, because it's very difficult for people to make sense of that with the amount of information and misinformation that they have. I don't want to talk about that now because it's really nothing I can do about it at the moment, but it is certainly something that absolutely needs to be brought into that system. So we've got a really good question in three parts from somebody who is on the is traveling and listening in, but they're enjoying the discussion. So the question is around, from a local government perspective, exactly what are the roles and responsibilities of local authorities in delivering net zero objectives? Have these been defined? Now, I'm happy to jump in here quickly, and then I'll come round the room to you. I'm a local government nerd, so I can tell you everything that I know about them. I mean, local governments are ranging anyway you know, they range from kind of district authorities, you know, that kind of lower tier, all the way through to bigger authorities who are responsible for education and social care and all these other things, but also up to, you know, what you were talking around there, Zoe, around these combined authorities or metro mayors where they've got elected mayors. Now, broadly, almost everything comes somewhere near local government at some point, whether they, you know, deliver your bins or deliver your waste, do your bins. They have a fleet of vehicles, they have their own buildings and assets, they look after planning, which is one of the biggest levers that we probably got for affecting the future of how we think about net zero, i.e. where do we put places that we work and live in the future to minimize transport impacts, etc., etc., etc. So loads of things, but I think because they've been, in my view, absolutely hammered for the last 10 years. They have no resources or that horizon scanning ability to be thinking forward about what is it and how do we join these things up? How do we influence things? And also, you know, local government and local authorities are political bodies. You know, they're not run by people who work there, they're run by politicians who you elect. And we have a democratic deficit because the people who elect, and usually in local elections, are a very small portion of the demographic, probably not many of the people who are going to have to deal and live and work and deliver the solutions to some of these problems. But that's just an opinion. That's my little intro. I'll come around to you guys. Anyone want to comment? Joe, let's come to you, because you're fairly new into new local now, but I know you've got lots of experience with local authorities.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think it's a great question, actually, and a great topic, and a really good opening gambit from you in that. So notwithstanding, I think your very serious point there, that local councils and capacity and resourcing has been severely curtailed over the last 12 years or so, and particularly, and you brought up planning. I think the latest stat was something like 55% fall in resourcing over that time period. That just has significant impacts at a local area. So I totally understand that, and that's really very difficult and challenging. To be a little bit more upbeat about it, I think councils have a huge opportunity here, actually, and planning is a really good example, because I think of planning actually as more of that place shaping kind of profession, rather than what it's probably turned more into over the last couple of decades, which is more development control. Everyone always thinks of planning as being, you can't build that there, and very few people think of planning as place shaping and ensuring a local area has all the access to all the things that it needs. But by its mere definition, I think there's a point here which is then trying to reconcile competing interests, trying to come to best solutions, trying to understand those trade-offs from a non-economic perspective, a trade-off for communities and so on. So I think there's a real opportunity here at a local level, perhaps certainly more so than a central government perspective, which is to join up departments, to join up thinking, to kind of be engaged in that kind of way, as Owen talked about, instead of those individual kind of siloed budgets. How are we going to work together on these kind of things? So there's something there, and quite important, I think, for local government, local councils, and the planning department as a whole. What I would say, I think, is really important, and something came up in a workshop that I was part of earlier this week, which was all about trying to move from like consultation to conversations. And that sounds terribly like dry or a little bit glib to say, but I think it's really important, because, you know, one of the important points to come out of that was actually a particular council's looking into, which communities to go and talk to and who to go and speak to and so on. And they were using census data of their local area. Of course, that's now, 11 years out of date. And actually communities that they know in their patch and on their turf who need assistance and help and have really legitimate views about moving forwards don't even show up in that census. So there's something here about local areas, local councils. How do you work with grassroots kind of organizations? How do you identify who to speak to? Are you speaking to the right kind of people? That notion of having series of iterative and deliberative conversations as you go through a process and help design that process, rather than tick, I've done some consultation and this is how we take it forwards. I think there's something really important and powerful there. It just takes innovative councils to kind of take that leap.
And may I just add that, you know, it was, I think Bristol City Council was the first council in England, at least, that called a climate emergency, and that was before Parliament. So I think local government also have a lot of leadership on this agenda. And now, of course, many have followed suit. And secondly, just to say, in terms of like that front line of that climate and economic justice, I think that's exactly where we see this. So, you know, the recent pushbacks against congestion charging or expansion of congestion charging in city centres is exactly, you know, the current example of where justice in terms of who's paying and is it fair, and whilst also delivering on net zero comes right to the fore. And of course, whilst local leaders might have the powers to introduce congestion charges, really they need the kind of backup support then of government to say, okay, now we're going to introduce, I don't know, a car scrappage scheme or something in order to make it vaguely affordable for anyone to think of alternatives.
Yeah, super interesting. Owen, did you want to come in? Love Bristol City,
Yeah,
by
I
the
was
way.
just going to add, I agree with all that's been said. I think one of the interesting things around kind of the declaration of climate emergency by various different local authorities is actually that it presented the opportunity for the organisations to work together. So I don't know whether that's always been taken. So where you've got kind of multi-tier arrangements, are people working together to understand what they can do as a collective of local authorities as much as individuals? And I think linked to that is kind of how do local authorities, as kind of anchor institutions within their own areas, really think about things like their own purchasing power? So how do they make sure the decisions they're making are ones that support this agenda? And also, how do they work to kind of create that behaviour change that's needed amongst populations? So we have a panel coming up with Cambridge Zero and Centre for Science and Policy, which is looking at that question. So how can local government work with behaviour change and think about those kind of techniques to really get people to take this stuff on board?
That was an immaculate segue, Owen, into this next point, because somebody's asked, some of the responses put forward by the panel suggest the need for some significant systems change, which is arguably, yes, of course they do, and absolutely. This takes time. How do we achieve positive impact in the short term? And to pick up on one of your points quickly, what I will say is that system change needs to start somewhere, though. It does take a long time, but unless we start that process now and start thinking about those things that we can tweak for systems change, it won't happen in time for us to do that. But the one thing you just made a really good point there, Owen, was around procurement and buying, because consumption is something that's really interesting in this space, yeah? Because local government and central government and you yourselves as human beings have a really key role to play in what you do in terms of your consumption. And actually you can stimulate good things to happen by doing good things. No one's going to change, no one's ever going to change like suddenly all become really, really, really good at what we're doing in terms of buying. But there are certainly things short term that we could be much better at. And I know that a number of local authorities, again, I'm agnostic in some ways around how local government's working, because it's, I think that it's been hit really badly. I've been in local government. I was in local government for 11 years, but there are things that it should be doing as well. That, there are things that could change. But one thing it has done, and I think it's been really interesting to see some of the, the really proactive councils in this space have really thought about how they buy, how they buy big contracts for stuff, how they're looking at those frameworks, and government does exactly the same, but it's less accountable. And it really needs to enter that picture of being more accountable about how it buys, spends millions, billions of pounds on stuff. If you're buying billions of pounds worth of something, of a company that is poor environmentally, is poor in terms of seeing that drip down, that drip down wealth going down the system, then, you're exacerbating the problem. That's a really easy thing to change. It's a political issue, but it's a really easy thing to change. So, I think that procurement and the way that we buy things and the way we stimulate markets is something we definitely have power over, because, that's how markets operate, right? So, I mean, be interested to hear some of your other thoughts from the panel on that, because, we've got about 7 minutes and I want to do a little bit of a wrap up quickly. So, and I do want to pick that last question up. So any thoughts on that, guys?
I think there's something really interesting in how organizations that want to think about systems change engage with people that have particular radical thoughts about this stuff. So thinking about what was radical 100 years ago is now seen as the norm. So actually, rather than seeing people that are kicking off about people not doing enough, putting their points forward, how do you really engage with those more radical voices and understand what they're trying to tell you as well, would be my thing, I think.
I think my perspective, very briefly, because I know you want to do a little wrap up, Paul, is I think there's a two-pronged approach here, and I think New Local takes this on board at its heart, right? There's a pragmatic, what can we do within the current system approach? And for us, that's all about sharing best practice across different councils. Often one doesn't necessarily hear about all the great work that's being done at a local level because the people understandably are too busy doing the thing that they're trying to overcome, right? So those councils are doing the thing and not necessarily publicising it. It's up to us to and our membership to try and share some of that best practice and move that forwards for different councils to be able to take on board whoever possible. I think that would be great. But then there's this secondary kind of bigger systems change, right, which is a central government lobbying change kind of perspective. And I think under that umbrella, there's lots we can unpack there, but under that umbrella, I'd like to separate the, rules and regulations and guidance umbrella from culture. And I think there's, if I took the Green Book as an example, and I'm now baiting Zoe into talking about this, as you can clearly see, Green Book for me is actually quite well written and it's quite open for me. And I think actually there's lots of things, it can still be improved and still add things into it. But I think broadly it's quite comfortable in how broad it is. However, the culture of how one applies that guidance, I think, is very much more orthodox, very much more old school. And I think we should always be mindful of separating the guidance from how people use the guidance. Was that sufficient bait for you, Zoe, there?
If you want me to mention Treasury, I'll mention Treasury. But I think, I mean, obviously I completely endorse the points made about influencing local leadership in particular, whether that's through community groups, whether that's through local pressure groups, whether that's through contacts people have with their local councillors or metro mayors. I suppose Treasury's very idea-led, so I would say people listening to this, economists, get into the Treasury, go do a talk on whatever your way into this topic is, to convince them that there's the sort of intellectual framework for this work to be taken forward. And as ever, whether academic or otherwise, kind of pragmatic steps to then put it into practice. You've got to give them the language to be able to use it internally and mainstream this sort of thinking, even if it seems like a slower pace than those of us on the outside.
Yeah, we won't make you go into Treasury talk anymore. I mean, my one point is it'd be great if this thinking was embedded in Treasury, but I'm sure that, from my experience in the last couple of years, I think that there, from a civil servants perspective, there has been some really good dialogue, even from civil servants who are really exciting in that space. And, I think that's a big of a systems change in itself. I'm going to come around to you and just ask you just one takeaway really, but just wanted to pick up, there's a question here around by April 2030, all the non-domestic rented buildings must have improved to EPC B, which is a massive undertaking for local government, which they are dependent on income. We're talking about housing stock here, I think, in the main. I mean, there's that's a stimulation for a market if there isn't one anyway, isn't that right? But I mean, yes, it will cost them a lot of money, and I think it really highlights the massive problem in aligning policy. I think that we haven't talked about policy at all today. I mean, but the alignment of policy, the way that we put policy in place, whether we're central government and local government, we put it together in such a ridiculous way. It's still not centered, and it's still not aligned, it's still not done together, it's still not done with the people who actually experience that policy. And we've just seen something coming out, talk about new right to buy receipts and all the other things. Government needs money to do this. There needs to be money to invest in housing stock. It picks up the housing problem, it stimulates the economy because more people have got access to the roof over their heads. It does these things. There's lots of things that could be joined up in that space. So yes, it's a big undertaking. I don't know the answer to that. Anyone want, put their hands on a postcard, I might set myself up a little construction skills company and specialise in retrofitting, because I'll probably make some money out of it by the end of the 2020s. So just quickly, because we've only got 2 minutes left, I really want to just come around to all of you individually and say takeaway, because we talk a lot about really abstract kind of really difficult systems concepts. So just like on a level for people here today who's been in this, is there one thing for you that it seems really tangible that you can take away in terms of the things that's going on right now, or things that we should be thinking about as people, business owners, civil servants, government officers, whatever the case may be? So I'll come to you, Owen.
Thanks, Paul. I think it's the breadth of stuff and the breadth of thinking that's going on about this is really encouraging. Lots of people are thinking about this in lots of different ways is really important. And also I think what the second thing, if I can do too, is kind of the link between net zero and inequality, and the fact that you need to tackle both at the same time, and that they're both linked rather than two separate issues.
Thanks, Owen. Yeah, really important. I'll go to you, Zoe, next, and then is it Joe?
Yeah, I think we're on a kind of precipice of this being put into practice. That anyone who's working on this, either internally as a civil servant or externally as a think tanker or a community leader, it's about now making this really practical and easy for policy makers at local government and central government to take forward, and showing them that we're right behind them. There's a big swell of work, as Owen has said. It's now just got to be put into practice, and they need that pressure put on them now.
Joe.
Quickly from me, conversations. Don't think about things like this in process terms. Have lots of conversations with lots of different communities, and be as mission-led as possible. That's how you draw together the right people to overcome the particular topic that will come from lots of different areas, lots of different places. Conversations, communities, mission-led.
Thank you, Joe. I'm not going to give my one takeaway, because I think I've given a load of takeaways here, and you guys have really been a fantastic panel. I would have really liked to go on to another couple of subjects. I'm going to think about how we do another session around this. I think it's super interesting. We've had lots of responses from, the people who are watching as well. The one thing I'm going to leave you with a thought. One thing we didn't talk about, and then I can't remember who mentioned the point. It might have been, I just don't know who mentioned the point. It might have been you, Joe, around the Industrial Revolution. I think that we are at the stage of another Industrial Revolution right now, and we haven't talked about the effects of the fourth Industrial Revolution or how that might play out in terms of both economics and net zero. But we are clearly in a digital revolution. That is something that's going to be ubiquitous in our lives for the next 10 years, and it will have a fundamental effect that is probably unprecedented, and we can't really use previous experience in. So I'd love to explore that at some time, whether it helps us or whether it hinders us in terms of both wealth disparity and our view to how we get to net zero. Obviously the data perspective is really helpful, but perhaps the weighting of wealth is something that we really need to be aware of. But I really want to thank you all for coming along. I know we've run over by a couple of minutes, and apologies for that. Thanks Zoe, thanks Owen, thanks Joe, and thanks to the ID, and thank you all for coming along and engaging, and please do get in contact with any of us. I think we're all on Twitter and all on LinkedIn, so I'm sure you can find us if you want to. Otherwise, come directly to the ID and we'll have a chat with you. But lovely to have you, and have a great rest of your week, everybody.